Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I'm your host, Brian Scott. Today we're going to talk about fears from past life memories through the teachings of Edgar Cayce. I'm reading from a book by Hugh Lynn Cayce, who is the son of Edgar Cayce. He does a very good job of summarizing a lot of Edgar Cayce's teachings. And in his book, Edgar Cayce Faces a Fear, a practical guide to overcoming life's anxieties. There's a very fascinating chapter called Fears from Past Life Memories that discusses the unique psychological role of past life fears that relate to where we are in our current life. Now, I am convinced I have a past life fear of heights. When I go to the Grand Canyon and stand over the ledge, I have an unusual fear. When I'm watching a video and somebody shows somebody standing high up in a building, this fear is coming from a different place. And it's like a memory. You may not believe in reincarnation, but I do believe our subconscious mind is made up of past experiences of humanity or a certain section of humanity. I think each of us are made up of different past life memories, even if you don't believe in the past life, because it's how the subconscious is advanced enough to do the things that it does. So I believe that we can learn by understanding this concept how to overcome certain fears, as I have used this to help overcome fears of heights. Cayce begins by describing a memory. Clop, clop, clop. The wooden-soled shower slippers made a rhythmic sound as the soldier came down the barrack aisle. The time was 1942. The place, Fort George G. Meade, between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. My carbine was dismantled on my bed as I cleaned each small part. I looked up as a naked figure, towel over arms, soap clutched in one hand, came opposite my cot. The man had dark hair and rather critical eyes set in a pleasant face. Then everything suddenly faded. We were in a desert place before a small fire. Two other teenage boys in flowing white garments sat across from me. One was the young man in front of me now. Tethered nearby were white racing camels. In the distance, I saw other camels with riders approaching. All three of us were afraid. The scene faded from my mind as I heard myself saying without reason, "I haven't seen you since you were caught stealing camels in the Gobi Desert." The young man stopped, looked at me intensely for a moment, then went on to take his shower. It was over a year later in England, as we were disembarking for France, that we first had any kind of conversation. What brought that strange, uncontrollable sensation of fear, not of death, because I felt that we knew the riders who were approaching, but fear of a very severe beating. It all transpired in a matter of seconds. Yet that scene has haunted me through the years. Recently, in a 2-hour television broadcast on the David Susskind Show, Gina Sermonera, psychologist and author of several fine books on reincarnation, stated that in her opinion, psychology would take on a new exciting dimension as reincarnation is taken into consideration. A number of psychologists with whom I work, including my son, Charles Thomas Cayce, a child psychologist working with psychically gifted children, suggest that we approach the concept of rebirth simply as a postulate. Let's suppose this is the way the world is operating. What questions does this idea answer? What helps does it give us in explaining some of the problems of personality and social structure? First, let us consider 4 different approaches to past life memory. From each, I just take one example of the memory of a previous life that explains a present life fear pattern. Then I return to the Edgar Cayce readings for numerous examples of fear that he suggests are carried over in the memory of other lives. Karma can be erased according to Cayce. More than 2,000 people have found help in working with their karmic fear patterns. Reverie. In his introduction to researches in reincarnation and beyond, Hamid Bey, the Coptic lecturer and teacher, speaks of his friend A.R. Martin, the author, as an ordained Coptic teacher. He goes on to say, "It has a great uplifting factor for all those who have become acquainted with this great subject, reincarnation, because the majority of Christians fear death. Why? because they believe that this is the only life we will ever live. Martin's approach for eliciting past life memories was the use of a reverie technique, similar to light hypnosis. The purpose of the reverie states was to help the searcher not just to play parlor games. People counseled by Martin and his daughter who continued his work were encouraged to discover that many fears were overcome. One case he describes is that of a woman who experienced in the present an unexplained fear, a horror really, of cats. In the reverie state, she reviewed an experience in Persia where she saw herself as a small child, a waif on the streets, who bothered a temple priest. She was taken by the priest to the stone image of a huge cat. By suggestion, the priest caused the cat's eyes to flash fire. With a curse from the cat, he drove the little girl from the temple. In the present, she feared and avoided all cats. After the reverie, the woman adopted a kitten and worked with herself in loving and feeding it, thus overcoming the disturbing fear. Chemical stimulants. Turning to another memory source for past lives, let us look briefly at the work of Stanislav Grof and his experience with psychedelic drugs for 18 years in Czechoslovakia and the United States. In the United States, he was chief of psychiatric research at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center in Baltimore, Maryland, from 1967 to 1973. In a vivid general description of the death-rebirth experience under LSD, Grof writes, "The experience of ego death is frequently associated with images of various terrifying and destructive deities mentioned earlier. He can also identify with a baby thrown by his mother into the devouring flames glowing inside a gigantic statue of Moloch. Another frequent symbol of the ego's death is the experience of the victim sacrificed to the Aztec sun god, Huitzilopochtli. Here, the individual feels that his body is being opened by an obsidian knife. If you dismiss this as totally symbolic, a talk with Grof might help you rethink your point of view. Deep personal memories can be aroused through the stimulants of LSD. Many of these memories lie in the unconscious behind very real fear patterns in our present lives. As mentioned earlier, I participated with 3 other people in a 2-hour television taping session with David Susskind on reincarnation. This took place in New York on May 14, 1976. One of the participants was Dick Sutphin, hypnotist and director of the Experimental Hypnosis Center in Scottsdale, Arizona. Dick hypnotized 2 members of the studio audience and regressed them to previous lives. Interestingly, both picked up fear-laden memories. The boy saw himself as an Indian boy being chased by soldiers. The girl seemed to relive an experience of being stoned in ancient Rome. In his book, You Were Born Again to Be Together, Dick Sutphin opens his 3rd chapter thus: "Oh my God, no, he was going to kill Ivan. I stabbed him, oh God, the blood, no. Linda was lying on the hypnotist's couch, trembling with emotion, tears running down her cheeks. In her mind, she was back in feudal England during a time of unrest and revolution. She was reliving the moment when she had saved the life of her husband, who was almost killed by another man. Was this a memory of a past life or a fabrication of the unconscious responding to the suggestion of the hypnotist? The unconscious is capable of such fabrication, and in some cases does piece together from such sources as books, television, and motion pictures a story which it can identify. But it is logical to believe that all regression to past life experiences, even those for which records are found, are fabricated. Moreover, there are a growing number of cases where such recountings under hypnotism relieve recurring fear memories, such as dream experiences or associated conscious thought patterns. Such cases make the charge of fabrication less convincing. It is possible that our unconscious does contain past life memories, and that they sometimes do surface. Fear, one of our strongest emotions, is logically the substance of many such memories. The present public interest in hypnosis as a regression technique is indicated by the many current magazine articles, paper books, and motion pictures. Let me mention just one more such example. The Louisville, Kentucky Courier-Journal and Times in 1977 carried an interesting article by Linda Borsch describing the work of Lawrence Allison, She reports that Allison hypnotized her and picked up a past life memory in which she was killed by her husband with a hammer. I would like to ask Mrs. Borsch how she feels now about hammers, childhood memories. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist who has for years been collecting and verifying stories of past life memories, especially those of children, suggests that traumatic fear patterns are carried over as memories from past lives. In his book, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation, Stevenson includes 7 cases from Alaska suggestive of reincarnation. In one case, Derek Pitnoff, a Tlingit Indian, was believed by his peers to be an incarnation of his great-great-grandfather from Wrangell, who was treacherously slain by a man from a hostile tribe from Sitka. Pitnoff had a scar on his body corresponding to the spear wound that he thought had caused his death in the previous life. Scrupulously fair, Stevenson writes, Mr. Pitnoff does not claim to remember the life and death of Chaknikuk, his great-great-grandfather, or for that matter, of anyone else. He does, however, exhibit 2 interesting and relevant behavioral traits. First, he recalls having had since childhood a marked fear of knives, bayonets, and spears. As a boy, he was afraid of knives and did not play with them like other boys. He had an intense dislike of bayonet drill when he was in the army during World War II. He did not let his children play with knives. This phobia does not extend to other dangerous weapons, such as firearms, but is restricted to dangerous blade weapons. Pitnoff's second behavioral trait that suggested a past life memory was his interest in improving relations between the people of Wrangell and the people of Sitka. Let me warn you that unless you decide to examine the evidence with an open mind, do not read Stevenson's book. It will disturb you. In my opinion, it is the best documented evidence available on the subject, carefully, critically, and painstakingly collected by a scientist widely recognized by his peers as a man of integrity. Edgar Cayce Concepts. Now, as far as we turn again to the Edgar Cayce psychic readings, let us consider the premise on which they rest. Cayce said that a human being is in essence a spiritual being, a soul. This essence or soul contains 3 building blocks: mind, will, and spirit. In this 3-dimensional form, the soul enters a body that attracts it and or to which it is drawn by choices made in previous lives, which remain in its computer-like unconscious memory. Some souls have probably reached a development pattern that enables them to exercise some choice at the periods of conception and physical rebirth. A child is not a new soul. It only has a new body. As Benjamin Franklin had printed on his tombstone, he would return with a new binding. The so-called memory of the soul is its karmic pattern. Each of us have memories of talents and special interests, as well as of weaknesses and negative emotional drives. The law of cause and effect is simply carried over from one life to another. As a soul moves from one body to another in the earth plane, it may change sex, race, and religion according to the way choice is exercised in relation to spiritual laws such as patience, faith, and love. Remember, the real life of the soul is other-dimensional. The soul did not begin in the earth. It will not end here. 3-dimensional life might be said to be a diversion from the real experience. The 3-dimensional earth plane is neither a hell nor a prison, but rather a school, through which by the mercy and grace of God we can come to remember our true relationship with the one Creator, our God. It is hard for average people to detach themselves enough from the desires of their 3-dimensional flesh bodies, driven by sex, struggles for survival, and pleasure-pain syndromes, to be able to even sense the existence of the spiritual essence, which seems to sleep in the deeper recesses of the body and mind, because the universally existent faces of fear inhibit and deter the awakening of the soul self. This is directed to the understanding and developing ways to deal with those fears. The following examples are taken from some 2,500 psychic discourses on past life experiences, given for over 2,000 different people. We must remember that these discourses were psychological analyses, explanations of weaknesses and problems, as well as advice for vocational guidance and mental and spiritual growth. Most were requested by people who had been helped by physical advice or were simply curious as a result of talking with some friend. Edgar Cayce did not give life readings until 1923. They were not widely publicized until the book There is a River by Thomas Sugrue appeared in 1941. Discourses on physical health continued to be the major focus of Edgar Cayce's psychic work until his death in January 1945. For a man 37 years old in 1929, Edgar Cayce described a Greek incarnation. While a tribal ruler was away, the entity, the man in a previous life, fought against those who attempted to usurp authority. Apparently, the entity misused his powers and became afraid. The fear turned on him, so to speak, and in another life he gained power over others that was not used constructively. Two sources of fear seem to be indicated. One, misuse of power, which created fear in others, and two, failure to use power for service in the present. The man was afraid of misusing power. The next case is an odd one, because the reading was sought for a child just 2 years old in 1942. The question was asked, is there any specific reason why he has so much fear of name of a specific family friend? The child withdrew and cried when this friend came near him. Edgar Cayce referred to an Egyptian experience where he said that the two entities had been associated. The now older friend of the family had been responsible for the previous death of the child in Egypt. A.T. Gersild also comments on children crying in the presence of some people but not others. A deeper memory may cause the fear. A reading was given for a 50-year-old woman in 1944. A peculiar source of fear was indicated. According to Edgar Cayce, she had been married at the time of Joshua to a Canaanite whose sister dealt with spirits and brought fear to the entity. She was warned in the reading not to get in touch with the person she asked about, the former sister-in-law. This is the source of fear, Cayce stated. In 1931, while giving a life reading for a 45-year-old woman, Miss Young, Edgar Cayce described her prior life in early America near Fredericksburg, Virginia, where the young girl was smothered in a cellar when Indians burned her home. Losing life in the experience by being crushed, this brings physical, innate influence of crowds or smothering feelings. With friends, this woman and her sister visited the Fredericksburg area, looking for records of this previous life. The sister later described an agonizing experience that took place in a motel on the outskirts of the city. During the night, she was awakened by Miss Young's labored breathing. Totally unconscious, the sleeping woman began to gasp for breath, turned red in the face, and threw herself off the bed to the floor. The sister shook and struggled with her to no avail. Finally, she called the friends who were traveling with them. In desperation, they threw a hotel ice pail full of water on her, and she woke up gasping and then began screaming. Miss Young had no memory of a dream experience. However, the sister wondered whether she had been reliving this mothering experience recounted by Cayce from a past life. It is possible to say, of course, that Miss Young may have taken the reading as factual and may have unconsciously dramatized the incident. Both sisters and friends assured Edgar Cayce that all her life Miss Young had become panicky in crowds and close places such as elevators. After this incident, her claustrophobia was not as severe. In the two following cases, quite opposite causes of the same type of fear are explained. Both women, one 16 years old when the reading was given in 1934 and the other 52 years old in 1944, were afraid of having sexual intercourse. In the first case, Edgar Cayce suggested that as a woman in early America, she had been raped by Indians. Cayce spoke of the opposite sex and went on to say, with the present experience, some fears that are deep in the innate experiences of the entity, the physical fear that exists in the innate experience from that sojourn, not that it does not desire companionship, for the fear itself calls for companionship in every way and in every expression. Of the second case, Cayce said in part, associations with individuals of the opposite sex that very often become repulsive to the entity, especially in sexual relationships, for the entity took those vows of chastity, purity, and devotion to celibacy. These have become innately displeasing at times, never satisfying or never gratifying desires for self or others. The second woman asked, "What have been the causes of so much fear in the entity's life?" Cayce answered, "Read just what has been indicated." Remember, the person was not present for the reading. The conductor simply asked Cayce written questions. The questions continue. How did the entity's inferiority complex originate? Cayce answered, "For the fear and dislike of men, you cannot be one who took vows and kept them, and then lightly turn around and try to gratify the appetites of those who are not easily satisfied." One final case from these records suggests that small children can carry over fear memories from former lives that can cause severe emotional disturbances. In 1943, a young couple brought their 4-year-old daughter to Edgar Cayce. She suffered from prolonged crying spells in which she frequently went into spasms. The mother explained that this occurred when the child was awakened suddenly by loud noises. Doctors' examinations indicated no physical disabilities. Edgar Cayce said, "For here we have a quick return from fear to fear through fear." The entity was a year or two older than the present when killed on the coast of Lorraine. Then, in less than 9 months, entered the material world again. He went on to suggest that the mother sit by the child as she was going to sleep and give her reassuring suggestions. It worked, and the emotional disturbances ceased. Working with the concepts. Previously, I told you the story of a man with structurally distorted ankles whose childhood memory was revived by Rolfing. Here is another story told me by Ida Rolf that seems to go back beyond childhood. The concerns of a young 30-ish English physician in training in a hospital at the time he told it. He came to me for Rolfing, and I was aware that at any time I had my hand anywhere near his neck, he flinched. Not merely was he afraid, but his flesh was afraid. I quickly recognized that if I wanted to get on with his general Rolfing, I would have to get on with it at once rather than take its time in the natural sequence. And so I started to work with him. And he said, "That's funny. I seem to be looking up into my foramen magnum. My head seems separate and I'm looking up in the foramen magnum." I waited for more details, but they were delayed. Finally, I said, "Where is your head? It seems to be on a table." No, now it's rolling." I said, "Keep your eyes on your head and see what happens to it." "Well, it seems to be rolling off the table and onto the floor, and now it's gone, and I don't have it anymore." Needless to say, I suspected a beheading, and perhaps it was superfluous to say he no longer feared for his neck, and we proceeded to an uneventful 10 hours. Manipulation released the flesh memory, and the fear was released. You may not find this conclusive, but it is another bit of evidence for time-extended memory. Here is a reverie case from my own experience. "What are you afraid of?" I asked the young man. He tried to speak. Dry lips moved. Words ran together. He choked a little, cleared his throat, then tried again. "I don't know," he said. During the week-long conference, I had been able to have several sessions of reverie with him. A familiar story came out slowly. A childhood trauma had lodged in the subconscious, and now at 22 had broken out to distort thought and action. His father had caught him and a younger sister together in sex play. The anger and violence that resulted engendered fear and antagonism toward his father, as well as a determination to continue sex acts. He felt a strange sexual attraction towards his sister, amounting to a fascination. This continued into late adolescence. He became jealous when his father himself made advances toward the girl. His mother was drawn into the angry, violent arguments that followed. Eventually, his parents divorced. The young man briefly attended a local college where he became accustomed to smoking marijuana daily. His grades suffered and he dropped out of school. His fascination with his sister continued, but he was crippled by fear whenever he spoke to any other girl. At 22, William had never had intercourse or dated a girl. In fact, when he first talked at an ARE field conference, it was difficult for him to look at another person in the eye. His head hung down, his words tumbled out incoherently and, for the most part, inaudibly. Could there possibly be something deeper than the childhood experience? The boy's fascination and the father's attraction for the same girl raised questions in my mind about a possible past life memory. The young man's emotions were very strong. The attraction of both men had persisted. I made it possible for William to attend another week-long conference on the West Coast and suggested that we continue the light reverie technique we had used for recalling details of childhood incidents. One day after several sessions, he relaxed completely and seemed less hesitant about following the suggestion. I told him to walk down a quiet, shady street and enter a small, empty theater. Sitting quietly alone in the empty theater, he was to see the curtain open and describe the scene. There is a man in a small empty house. He's very sad. His wife has left him. The young man told me haltingly, "Never had I heard such sadness as was expressed in the voice of this sleeping young man." Further description of the scene brought the information that there had been 2 small children and that the wife had run away with another man. He felt that he was the man in the small house. Although he described the wife differently from the present sister, he felt they were the same person. Could there have been a past life memory pushing the child, the adolescent, the young adult toward the sexual relationship with the sister, in spite of moral taboos and his father's anger? In any event, talking about the situation and his praying for his sister and the father somewhat cleared the crippling fear of contact with other girls. He wrote me recently to report, "I've had my first date. It wasn't too bad, but I was scared. Other dates have followed, and friends who know William have reported that he now looks people in the eye, smiles, and is beginning to talk more easily with those around him. He has a hard road ahead, but he is on his way." Conclusions. Whatever your present thoughts are about reincarnation, the concept of more than one life experience on Earth, try to keep your mind open. I do not claim that I can give you proof of rebirth. The whole subject is too controversial in America for the average person to be objective about it. However, this ancient belief has been incorporated in the tenets of many of the world's major religions and has been taught by outstanding thinkers in others, including Judaism and Christianity. In the minds of many uninformed people, it has come to be associated with occultism, devil worship, and witchcraft. If we have indeed lived before, we are total composites of all our experiences, in just as real a sense as we are the sum totals of all we have experienced in this life. Evidently, as our 5 senses begin to function, we put a protective covering over negative and positive soul memories. Only our strongest urges, good and bad, come through as patterns, which are generally emotional. Perhaps we are more complex than we know. Is it possible that we have a time dimension that plays a little understood but certainly a very important influence in our lives? It is worth considering, I think, but more important is the possibility that we can, through understanding the causes of our problems and accepting responsibility, begin to transform our negative patterns, including fears, into positive, constructive action. Now, we have talked about reincarnation many times on previous episodes. Ultimately, the law of one is saying that we do have many past lives, that we are moving through densities taking 75,000 years, eventually reaching a point through the accumulated experience of our past lives where we make a choice whether to serve the self or others in this density. Neville Goddard is saying there is no reincarnation, but then gives an explanation of something very much like reincarnation in talking about going back to the wheel, experiencing lives in different zones of time. Joseph Murphy was the one who said that there was no reincarnation and that we all reincarnate as the same being, which resonates with what U.S. Anderson says in 3 Magic Words, that we're all the same being. I think there's levels to this, that all can work together, that our soul can go through wheels and wheels of different experiences, that we can reincarnate, and that we are all the same being at the same time. The law of one is saying we're all one being, and that we are reincarnating, eliminating that contradiction. So then we'd start to realize that many of the fears and blueprints that we walk around with may come from past lives. It may come from ancestral past lives. We may have things passed down through our genes. Fears of heights, of different things. If you're fearful for things and you don't know why, it could be ancestral in nature, or it could be reincarnation. I have memories and experiences of falling down a mountain that have crept into my life that I had never experienced, and I had a fear of heights because of it. So it's possible that I acquired this knowledge as my subconscious formed from an imprint on the universal mind, or it's possible that this happened in a past life. But either way, we can deal with some of our inlaid fears that we deal with in our consciousness by acknowledging and recognizing that there may be some other component to our memories that goes beyond our current incarnation of life. It could be either accessing other memories of the universal subconscious mind, or it could be reincarnational memories. But in any case, if you are having irrational fears that you can't explain, this may be one of the explanations to help you understand it and overcome it. Let me know if you have fears that you have learned about may have resulted from past life experiences, or if you had relationships or unusual things that are related to past life memories that you've had. It's really interesting when I ask those questions and I look in the comments, I find all kinds of really fascinating answers. So share with me, I would love to know. You can find all episodes of The Reality Revolution at therealityrevolution.com. Check out my art at www.newearth.art. And welcome to The Reality Revolution.